Hi, Jonathan. Thanks for having me. Well, it's quite the opposite in Sri Lanka. He's the most famous architect Sri Lanka ever produced. I myself am Sri Lankan. I grew up there, and at various times in my life, had the pleasure of visiting some of the 115 buildings that he designed throughout his career. And so he's revered in the country. And that's why I was so passionate about making a documentary that really shared his genius with the rest of the world. His style was that he actually had no style,
Nicely put.
Yeah, none of these buildings look like each other, and that's hence the title of the film, "The Genius of the Place." It is kind of a play on words. He is a genius, certainly, but his architectural approach was to first connect with the genius of each location, the genius loci coming from the Roman gods, the spirit of the place, the unique spiritual energy of each place. And so he would literally go to site, sit there for 2 or 3 days, quietly chain smoking, and then put pen to paper and design something remarkable. In a way, it was almost like a custom suit each time, him designing a piece of architecture that perfectly fitted the terrain and the energy and the contours of the place. So that's why he everybody calls him, the cliche is to call him a tropical modernist, but he was way more than that. He was actually a true experimentalist in trying lots of different styles, but always guided by nature and sensitivity to terrain. Yes, and I think that was, certainly in the first part of his career, he was very influenced by the modernist, movement of the time. And so he did spend a lot of time building, things in that international modernist style. But then he very quickly, went much deeper than that, drawing on his knowledge of indigenous architecture, for example. So in Sri Lanka, they've been building buildings for two millennia, which were open to the wind,
yes,
which were open to the elements. It was only when the British came along, and colonized the country that Sri Lankans started building things that were echoes of British bungalows, very small enclosed houses with very small windows, pitched roofs, perfect for like a Sussex countryside, but terrible for a Sri Lankan countryside. And so he was the one who said, listen, we had a marvelous tradition of building in this country, which we've forgotten. So he took that and he blended it with his encyclopedic knowledge of architecture from all around the world, and really created something truly unique that I think the world deserves to see. Yeah, that was an iconic house that he designed in the 60s. So iconic, in fact, that as we see in the film, when it was in danger of being demolished, it was completely deconstructed and reconstructed in a new location to preserve it. Oh my gosh, it was, talk about a labor of love. It took them 6 years, this team of architects and archaeologists and designers, to meticulously number every single pebble and brick in the house, to deconstruct it and move it 3 hours down the coast to the gardens of Lunaganga, where it sits now. And when you walk into that space, it's like a breath of fresh air, because as you mentioned, it has a garden in the center of the house, around which the four planes of the house are arranged. And so it is a complete inversion of a bungalow, which is about insulation, and instead it becomes about being exposed to the elements. And again, drawing on the Sri Lankan tradition of a Matha Mithila, which is a central courtyard, but updating it in a really refined and contemporary way. Yeah, and in the film is dedicated to his collaborators, and I say in the end, without whom his dreams would not have come true. And he was really blessed to have people like Ina De Silva, who's a fabulous fabric textile designer, Barbara Sansoni, who's also another iconic designer and artist in Sri Lanka, Lucky Sinanayaka, who was a fabulous illustrator and artist. And so the four of them actually were kind of like the four musketeers. They would always go into projects together and come up with something that was really contemporary for its time in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And his work is all the better for the collaborations he did with those three and many, many others who kind of helped raise his game, so to speak. Yeah, he was, almost a kind of a talented Mr. Ripley figure. He came from a very privileged background, studied in England, traveled around Europe, did the grand tour, visited all of the, architectural wonders of Italy, and he was a lawyer, but he got to the point where I think in his 30s or 40s, he said, I don't want to do this anymore, and I want to start designing gardens and buildings. And so he came late to the profession, but because of that, he came equipped with a tremendous depth of knowledge and taste. His taste was impeccable. And so even though he didn't understand the technical aspects of architecture when he started, he drew on that taste and this dazzling imagination, to start a journey that was quite legendary over 4 decades. Yes, and in fact, many of the buildings have bits and pieces that he started and just didn't finish. There are doors that lead to nowhere because he kind of just changed his mind mid-flow and said, actually, no, we don't need a door there. And there are stories of him, knocking down walls and reconstructing them, midway through construction. The analogy which I would use is he was almost like a jazz musician. He was improvising a building into existence, and all the construction workers and his team were kind of like jazz musicians, just riffing on his ideas, to come up with something. And so he never stopped tinkering with his buildings. To him, they were, as I make the point in the documentary, to him, a building was like a garden. It was something that kept growing, right throughout existence. And I think that's another secret of his work that I wanted the world to know about. Yeah, I really struggled with what to call the film, because it says he's one of Sri Lanka's legendary architects, but he was a landscape gardener as much as he was an architect. And again, I think that is one of the secrets of his technique, was that he approached gardens like buildings and buildings like gardens. And what I mean by that was he was never afraid to let a building grow into existence and assume its rightful form, But at the same time, he approached gardening like architecture. He would legendarily, terraform his estates like Lunaganga. Like other people would move furniture, around in their living room. He would cut down trees and, lop the tops of hillsides. And so he achieved this synthesis of, the soul of a gardener and the mind of an architect in complete synthesis.
Yes.
Which is why, one of his hallmarks is the blurring of the lines between the inside and the outside. And, environmentalists criticized him for that throughout his career. When he built the Kandalama Hotel, which is this beautiful, magical, jungle palace. So this is a hotel that he started building in the 1990s in a pristine part of Sri Lanka near the Cultural Triangle, near Sigiriya. And legend has it, he was flying over the site in a helicopter and said, I want to build this building into the ridgeline of a cliff. And after some persuading, the hotel company let him build it there. It took some persuading to let him pull this off. There were, for example, environmentalist groups who tied him up in litigation. There were Buddhist monks who threatened to set themselves on fire because they didn't want this land despoiled. But that only spurred him on, and he built this incredible building, which is almost a kilometer long in width, that perfectly blends into the jungle. The jungle grows over it, and took such care with sustainability and the environment to not despoil this land. And history has him vindicated because it's now seen as a landmark hotel. It's given jobs to thousands of people in the area. And I'm pretty sure the Buddhist monk no longer wants to set himself on fire. Yeah, interesting analogy. Yeah. Again, going back to his knowledge of the ancient world and ruins, and seeing things that were thousands of years old. I make Renzo Piano, the amazing Italian architect, said, great architects paint with light. In the documentary, I make the point that Bao went further. He painted with time, and so he had the vision to see something that looked ugly at its inception and say, but wait, give it 10 or 15 years, Yeah, and there's a wonderful moment in the documentary when Chana Daswata, who's one of his incredible collaborators, was wheeling Bawa in a wheelchair, after he had a stroke through Kandalama, and Bawa puts his feet down on the ground and stops the wheelchair and starts crying, and Chana's trying to figure out what's going on, and he says it was at that moment Bawa finally saw Kandalama as it should be. 15 years later, when the jungle had grown over everything, it was the culmination of that vision he had fought so hard for, and that brought him to tears at that moment. He's very big. For example, the Australian architect Kerry Hill, who did amazing work in the Amman hotels, for example, he's acknowledged Bawa as a tremendous influence on his work. Throughout Southeast Asia, he's hailed as a hero because for the first time, he gave South Asians something to be proud of in terms of a vernacular architecture that drew on indigenous traditions and completely helped people think about architecture in that part of the world with a sense of pride that we didn't have to copy something, but we could find our own language. And so that's another reason I wanted to make this documentary, to say he deserves to be up there with amazing 20th century architects. I believe, whether it's Oscar Niemeyer in Brazil, whether it's Frank Lloyd Wright, I believe he belongs in that pantheon. He's in that company of visionary architects operating well ahead of their time, and whose work should now be seen by the world, because it can still inspire us at this moment. Yeah, Sri Lanka is such a beautiful island, but it's keeps having bad luck hit it, in multiple ways, whether it's the civil war that ran for so long, it's been hit by tsunamis, it's been hit by economic, fallout. But it's resilient and it keeps going, which is another reason I wanted people to see these beautiful buildings, get on a plane and go and visit the country. And what was interesting about Bawa was he took those challenges and used them to spur himself on to greater heights. So, in the 60s, when he was building the Ina da Silva House, there was a shortage of Western industrial materials. And so that's why he went back to using indigenous Sri Lankan solutions with pebbles, red tiles, stucco walls, all of which was readily available. And so that those constraints actually pushed him even further to come up with something really, that is of its place. So this, I don't know if you know this, but the word serendipity comes from the island of Sri Lanka.
Indeed.
And there was a serendipitous moment, again, caused by, a problem, when we were filming, Sri Lanka was going through the beginnings of the economic fallout, and there were power cuts, at night, unexpectedly, and we had to shoot one of the locations, which is the Red Cliffs house. We had to cancel our plans to shoot it in the evening and get up in the morning and shoot it at 3:00 to fake dusk. And I happened to turn around and see an empty chair sitting in the middle of the garden, where I had been sitting at 3:00 that morning looking at a monitor. I just said to, the cinematographer, hey, just shoot that chair. There's something very eerie about that empty chair sitting by itself in the garden. And it was only when we were talking to a cook who had been at that property for many, many years, who said, oh yeah, Mr. Bawa used to sit in a chair like that when he first, started dreaming up this property. And then that gave us the idea of how to fill the void of Mr. Bawa himself. There is no footage of Mr. Bawa anywhere. In fact, I think there's only one audio fragment of his voice. And so in every location, we would find a chair, oftentimes a chair, by the way, that he himself had designed, and place it in a location that we felt he would have sat in to absorb the genius of the place. And so there's 5 chairs in 5 different locations on top of a cliff, in the gardens of Kandalama. And the chair is there to represent the missing genius of Geoffrey Bawa. Thank you so much. I hope everybody gets a chance to see it. And more than that, I really hope that inspires people to get on a plane and go to Sri Lanka and visit these amazing buildings in real life. All of them are places you can stay at. They're all hotels or villas. And so I really hope this begins a global reappraisal of Mr. Bawa's work.